Lake Superior, Michigan Territory, December 1835. Henry Rowe, Schoolcraft, stood at the edge of his trading post and watched the temperature fall. The mercury in his thermometer had been dropping since noon, and now at dusk, it had settled at 38 degrees below zero. The fire in the post's stone fireplace was consuming birch logs at a rate that would exhaust his woodpile in 2 weeks. The walls of the post were double-planked with a gap filled with sawdust, the best insulation that frontier carpenters could provide, and still the cold crept in. Schoolcraft's fingers were numb. His breath froze on his wool blanket. He had been an Indian agent for 12 years, had married into the Ojibwe nation, had learned to speak the language and eat the food and wear the clothing. But he had never learned to build a fire that would last through the night without constant feeding. The Ojibwe hunters who camped outside his post in their birch bark wigwams had no such problem. Their fires burned all night on a handful of wood. Their shelters stayed warm. Their children slept without shivering. Schoolcraft walked out into the frozen dark, crossed the snow to the Ojibwe camp, and asked an old hunter named Ningai to show him the secret. Ningai showed him a fire lay that used 4 sticks arranged in a pattern that Schoolcraft had never seen. The fire burned for 8 hours on 2 pounds of wood. The trader went back to his post, rebuilt his fire, and slept warm for the first time in 12 winters. This is the story of the simple fire trick that changed everything, the method that turned a few sticks into a furnace, and the man who wrote it down before it was lost. Main script body: Henry Rowe. Schoolcraft was not a stupid man. He was a geologist, an ethnologist, a student of the natural world who had published papers on the formation of copper deposits and the language of the Ojibwe people. He had traveled the Great Lakes region for 20 years, had survived blizzards and shipwrecks and encounters with hostile bands. He knew the value of a good fire. He also knew that the fires he built were not good. They consumed too much wood. They burned too fast. They needed constant attention. He would wake in the night to find the flames had died and the cold had returned. He would feed the fire more logs, wait for the blaze to catch, and go back to sleep. An hour later, the same thing. He was burning through his woodpile at an alarming rate. The forest around his post had been picked clean for miles. Every log had to be hauled by dog sled from farther and farther away. He was spending more time gathering fuel than he was doing his job, and still he was cold. The Ojibwe hunters who lived in the birch bark wigwams outside his post had no such problems. They built fires that burned all night on a handful of sticks. They slept warm. They woke to coals that could be revived with a breath and a few dry twigs. Schoolcraft had watched them do this for years, but he had not understood what he was seeing. He assumed they used some special kind of wood, or that their fires were smaller than they appeared, or that the birch bark wigwam somehow trapped the heat more effectively than his log post. It was only when his own situation became desperate that he swallowed his pride and asked for help. Ningai was an old man, perhaps 60, with a face that had been carved by wind and cold into a mask of deep lines and calm eyes. He had been hunting the shores of Lake Superior since before Schoolcraft was born. He had seen fur traders come and go. He had watched them build their fires the same way every time, never learning, never adapting, burning through the forest to stay warm for a single winter. Ningai did not speak much English, but Schoolcraft spoke Ojibwe well enough to ask his question. How do you make a fire that lasts all night? Ningai looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. He gathered 4 sticks. Each stick was about as thick as a man's thumb and about a foot long. He laid them on the ground in a pattern that Schoolcraft had never seen. The pattern was the key. Ningai placed 2 sticks parallel to each other, about 6 inches apart. He placed the 3rd stick across them, perpendicular, forming an H shape. Then he placed the 4th stick diagonally across the 3rd, forming a sort of star. The whole assembly was only a few inches high. Ningai tucked a handful of dry birch bark under the center of the star and lit it with a strike of his flint and steel. The bark caught. The flames licked up through the sticks. Within a minute, the sticks were burning steadily. Ningai added no more wood. He sat back and watched. Schoolcraft watched too. The fire burned. The flames were not large, but they were hot. The sticks glowed red at their tips. The fire burned for 2 hours before the first stick was consumed. When that stick broke, Ningai pushed the remaining sticks together, and the fire continued. The entire pile of 4 sticks burned for 8 hours. 8 hours. 4 sticks. Schoolcraft asked Ningai to show him again. Ningai showed him again. Schoolcraft asked him to explain why it worked. Ningai thought for a moment, then said something that Schoolcraft later translated as, "The fire eats the wood from the ends, not the middle. The ends are where the heat goes. The middle is where the wood waits." What Ningai had shown him was the starfire lay, a technique used by indigenous peoples across North America for thousands of years. The principle is simple but brilliant. A typical European fire lay consisted of logs stacked parallel to each other, like a log cabin or a teepee. The fire burned in the center, consuming the logs from the middle outward. The flames were large and hot, but they were inefficient. The heat of the fire caused the logs to release volatile gases, which burned as flames, but much of the heat escaped upward before it could transfer to the remaining wood. The fire needed constant feeding because the logs burned from the outside in, and the flames were always reaching for new fuel. The starfire lay inverted this process. The sticks were arranged so that they burned from the ends inward, not from the sides. The flame was concentrated at the center, where the ends of the sticks met. The heat from the fire traveled along the length of each stick, drying the wood ahead of the flame, preheating it, making it ready to burn. The sticks burned slowly, steadily, like a candle burning from the wick. A single stick could burn for hours because only the tip was in the flame. The rest of the stick was waiting. The physics of the starfire lay are elegant. Wood burns at about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The flame itself is much hotter, up to 2,000 degrees at the core. When a stick is placed in a starfire, the tip of the stick is in the flame. The rest of the stick is outside the flame, but it is being heated by radiation from the fire. The heat travels down the stick, driving out moisture and volatile gases. Those gases travel back toward the tip, where they ignite and add to the flame. The stick is essentially cooking itself from the inside, preparing its own fuel for combustion. The rate of burning is controlled by the rate at which heat can travel down the stick. That rate is slow, much slower than the rate at which a log in a conventional fire burns. The starfire is a self-regulating system. It burns as fast as it can, but it cannot burn fast. The physics won't allow it. Schoolcraft wrote about the starfire lay in his journal. The Indian method of constructing a fire is so different from our own that it seems almost a different art. We build our fires to burn bright and hot, consuming the wood rapidly and requiring constant replenishment. The Indian builds his fire to burn slowly, steadily, and with almost no attention. He uses 1/4 the wood that we use, and he sleeps through the night while we are up feeding the flames. The difference is in the arrangement of the sticks. We lay ours parallel. He lays his in a star. The ends of his sticks meet at the center, where the flame is. The rest of each stick extends outward, away from the heat. The fire creeps down the stick, taking hours to consume what our fire would consume in minutes. It is a method that every traveler in cold countries should learn, for it may save his life. The starfire lay was not the only fire trick that the indigenous peoples of North America had developed. There was the pyramid fire lay, used for cooking, in which logs were stacked in alternating layers, each layer perpendicular to the one below, creating a structure that collapsed into a bed of coals at precisely the right time. There was the long fire lay, used for sleeping, in which logs were laid parallel to the length of the sleeping area so that the heat radiated evenly along the bodies of the sleepers. There was the reflector fire, built against a wall of rocks or logs, which radiated heat back toward the shelter instead of allowing it to escape into the night. There was the trench fire, dug into the ground, which protected the flames from wind and concentrated the heat in a narrow channel. Each fire lay had a purpose. Each was optimized for a specific condition. The starfire was optimized for one thing: burning all night on almost no wood. These methods were not random inventions. They were the result of generations of observation, trial, and deep understanding of nature. Indigenous communities knew how different types of wood burned, how wind moved across open land, and how heat could be controlled rather than wasted. Fire was not just a source of warmth or a way to cook food. It was a carefully managed tool shaped to meet the needs of survival. The pyramid fire, for example, allowed a steady transition from flames to coals, perfect for cooking meals that required consistent heat. The long fire created a natural heater, stretching warmth across a sleeping space without needing constant attention. Reflector fires made small shelters surprisingly comfortable, even in cold conditions. Trench fires, hidden below ground level, were especially useful in windy or exposed environments. Together, these fire lays reveal a simple truth. Efficiency mattered. Every stick of wood counted. And in that world, knowing how to build the right fire could mean the difference between comfort and hardship, or even life and death. The star fire lay spread through the fur trade in the early 19th century. French voyageurs learned it from their indigenous wives. British traders learned it from the voyageurs. American mountain men learned it from the traders. By the 1840s, the star fire was standard practice among the men who trapped beaver and traded furs across the Rocky Mountains. Jim Bridger used it. Kit Carson used it. Jedediah Smith used it. They called it the Indian fire, or the hunter's fire. They taught it to greenhorns who showed up from the east with no idea how to survive a winter in the mountains. The greenhorns who learned the star fire lived. The ones who did not sometimes froze. The star fire lay is not the only way to build a long-burning fire. There is also the Swedish torch, also called the Canadian candle or the Finnish torch. This technique involves splitting a log partway down, stuffing kindling into the split, and standing the log on end. The fire burns from the top down, consuming the log slowly over many hours. A Swedish torch made from a 12-inch diameter log will burn for 6 to 8 hours, producing a steady flame that is ideal for cooking or for providing light. The technique was developed independently by several cold climate cultures and was popularized in North America by Swedish and Finnish immigrants in the 19th century. There is also the Dakota fire hole, a technique used by the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. The Dakota fire hole consists of 2 holes dug in the ground, connected by a tunnel. The fire is built in one hole. The tunnel draws air into the bottom of the fire, providing oxygen that makes the fire burn hotter with less smoke. The top of the fire hole can be covered with a pot or a grill. The fire is invisible from a distance, which made it useful for hunting and for hiding from enemies. The Dakota fire hole also uses wood efficiently because the surrounding earth reflects heat back into the fire and insulates it from the wind. But the star fire lay remains the simplest and most effective method for sleeping warm with limited fuel. All you need are 4 sticks. Any sticks will do, as long as they are dry and roughly the same size. Hardwood like oak or maple burns longer than softwood like pine or spruce, but any wood will work. Lay 2 sticks parallel, about 6 inches apart. Lay the 3rd stick across them, perpendicular, in the middle. Lay the 4th stick diagonally across the 3rd so that all 4 stick ends meet in the center. Place a handful of tinder, birch bark, dry grass, a cotton ball soaked in petroleum jelly under the center. Light it. The tinder will ignite the stick ends. The fire will spread slowly along the sticks. Push the sticks inward as they burn to keep the ends together. The fire will burn for hours. The star fire lay works best with a reflector. A rock wall, a log, a mound of snow, anything that reflects heat back toward the sleeper will increase the efficiency of the fire dramatically. The Ojibwe built their star fires in front of a wall of green logs, which reflected the heat into their wigwams. The green logs did not burn because they were green. They simply glowed and radiated warmth. A star fire with a reflector can keep a sleeper warm at 40 below using nothing but a handful of sticks. The star fire lay also works best when the sleeper is between the fire and a second reflector. A wall of rocks or logs behind the sleeper will reflect body heat back toward the sleeper, creating a double layer of warmth. The fire heats the sleeper from one side. The reflector heats the sleeper from the other side. The sleeper is essentially wrapped in a blanket of radiated heat. This technique was used by the indigenous peoples of the Great Basin. who slept in the open with no shelter at all, using only a fire and 2 reflectors to keep warm through nights that dropped well below freezing. Schoolcraft published his observations in a series of articles and books that were widely read in the eastern United States and in Europe. His writings on Ojibwe fire techniques were among the first to describe indigenous fire science in detail. He gave credit to Ningai, naming him specifically, which was unusual for the time. "I owe my knowledge of this method to an old hunter of the Ojibwe nation," Schoolcraft wrote. "His name is Ningai, which means little goose in his language. He is a man of few words, but great wisdom. He showed me the star fire on a night when the thermometer stood at 38 degrees below zero. I have used it every winter since. I have taught it to every traveler who has passed through my post. It has saved lives, I have no doubt. And it came from Ningai, who learned it from his father, going back to a time before memory." The Starfire lei is not a lost technology. It is still used today by survival instructors, wilderness guides, and backcountry campers who know the value of a fire that burns all night on a handful of sticks. It is taught in survival schools across North America and Europe. It is included in military survival manuals. It is one of the first skills taught to students of bushcraft and primitive living. But it is not common knowledge. Most people who build fires still build them the European way, stacking logs parallel, feeding the flames, waking in the night to add more wood. They do not know that 4 sticks arranged in a star will burn for 8 hours. They do not know that there is a better way. They do not know because no one showed them. Ningai showed Schoolcraft. Schoolcraft wrote it down. The knowledge was preserved. It was not lost. It was simply forgotten. Drop a comment below. What's the longest you've ever kept a fire burning on the smallest amount of wood? Have you ever tried the Starfire lei, or do you have another fire trick that saves fuel? Where are you watching from? And what survival skill did someone teach you that changed everything? Hit that subscribe button for one survival technique every week, and hit the like button if this story changed how you think about the fire in your fireplace. Because sometimes the difference between a good fire and a great fire is not more wood. It is knowing how to lay the sticks.